Hello, tonight telesur hosts exclusive interview with Venezuela's Attorney General Tarek William Saab. Now we are going to go with a journalist, Luis Blandon. He's there at the headquarters in Caracas, Venezuela, the headquarters of our multi-platform telesur, to speak with this high official of the Bolivarian government that is going to offer key topics, that is going to assess key topics related to the political environment in Venezuela just a few weeks after the kidnapping of President Nicolás Maduro Moros and also First Lady, First Combatant Celia Flores following the criminal actions perpetrated by the United States on Venezuela. Let's go now live.
I am joined now by one of the voices of the institutionality, the Attorney General of Venezuela, Tarek William Saab. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for this opportunity of speaking before an audience that expects always to hear other voices and not always, with the redundancy, letting themselves be led by the digital platforms, particularly of the news transnationals.
Yes, and of course we will go over that as well if we have enough time. So starting with this, how do you describe, we know what we have had a couple of weeks, but what happened that January 3rd? There's still a lot of debate in Venezuela on international law, but how is Venezuelan state in that case?
Well, look, in the first place, what needs to be highlighted is the firmness, the dignity, the absolute dignity of our people, of the National Bolivarian Armed Forces, of the institutions of the state, of the popular movement, of the social movement, and obviously of the acting president, Dr. Delcy Rodriguez, of leading and directing in function of what has happened, an act that I qualified not only attempted directly against international law, but left it literally in practical as a dead letter. After seeing the sequence of what happened from the year 2023 in Gaza, before the accomplices of the great powers of the land that did absolutely nothing to avoid a mass murder and an ethnic cleansing that could have easily have killed and disappeared women that were pregnant, children, especially women, and also children, to look for the procreation in that place, that beautiful place, biblical of Palestine as is Gaza. What did the world do facing this? What did international law and the organisms, the binding organisms to human rights, or the Security Council of the UN to avoid that? And that was a permanent denunciation of President Nicolás Maduro. If there was a chief of state who spoke to the planet to denounce this act, was President Nicolás Maduro, in the terms that everyone knows. International has their hands in the kidnapping of the President of the Republic, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, Celia Flores, the First Lady. And obviously, when I say that an agony is like a metaphor, I have said that if we go to the facts, international law has died. And I put the example of Gaza and Palestine and compare it with Venezuela. Why? Because you could have it that there's a catalog of documents that are binded to international law, the Geneva Convention, the International Pact of Civilian and Political Rights, and what has to do with the treaties binding to the International Court of Justice, what has to do also with the International Court and the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights itself, signed on December 10th of 1948. And when one does all of that sequence step by step, one notes that there is obviously instruments and signings that are linked to public international law and the international human rights and to international humanitarian law. Yes. Now, if we go to the facts when they're not respected, when they say there is a limit at the time of acting in a country that is not at war with another country. In the case of Venezuela with the United States, there has not been such war. What does international law say? What do the constitution of the planet say? That you cannot start a military aggression, especially not kidnap a president. That is prohibited. When one does it, one crosses the red line, and that was what happened in the Venezuelan case. The Venezuelan airspace was violated, our national sovereignty, the Constitution of the United States was violated. That makes reference that a president and a chief of state has powers of war, but those are limited to what? If one is going to act against a nation, one must have two fundamental lines. One, that the US is at war with the nation where the president is going to use those war powers. According to the Constitution, in the case of the US and Venezuela, that doesn't exist. There has not been such a war. Where does that armed conflict appear? It doesn't exist. Secondly, in the case that one is going to act in the terms that the Constitution mandates, one needs to have the permission of the Congress of the US, and that didn't happen. Now, the action was a war. Of course, combat airplanes were used, missiles, warships, drones, helicopters and bombers, and it is calculated from 100 to 120 people murdered between civilians and military, and obviously all of that massacre ended violating international law. According to the acts of war, for you to have an idea, they're limited. One cannot use it because they go against the fundamental principles, which are all of this that I have mentioned. If one says that the use of force is prohibited, the US did not abstain from using force if there's an equality, a sovereign equality of the states. Here, they didn't respect the US, that Venezuela is a sovereign country and everyone is equal, whether they are international powers or not. They're equals before international law. And an interesting fact, in the peaceful situation to also speak on the controversies and the dialogue. There was a dialogue ongoing that was pulverized. There was a call between the President Nicolas Maduro and President Donald Trump before these attacks, and it was against the beginning of that dialogue that had as an afterstep a meeting between both presidents. Now, if you say to me, because when I say that this has happened de facto through the facts and the bombings and the shooting, the death of international law, it is because I am pointing out where the UN Charter was left. There's an article, the article number 2, the 14th number, that prohibits the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity of a nation. It prohibits. Where was that left? But I said on December 6th, when a commission of the National Assembly went to inform us of the installation of itself, I denounced that the principle of presidential immunity was...
You were saying personal immunity, absolute immunity. What is that?
Well, it is a principle in the first place that comes from the International Court of Justice. So many times I would say many times one doesn't finish of understanding through the verb. It is acclaimed as an instance. These superpowers will always mention the International Court of Justice. One of their principles is the personal absolute immunity, and it has a failure. And I can say it, and you can look at it. In the year 2002, they had a failure to describe the orders of arrest. The president and functions cannot be arrested, especially not kidnap him or process him, especially not in a jurisdiction that does not correspond to the Venezuelan territory. But likewise, there is a pact, the International Pact of Civil and Political Rights, and in Article number 1 establishes clearly the sovereignty of the peoples. All of the peoples have the free right to their self-determination. In virtue of this right, it is established freely the political condition and also foresee the development of the economy, social and cultural. Where was that pact left? There was a hope for the peoples of the land. Where is the sovereignty? Where is... So then see the catalog of rights that were vulnerable. For that reason, Venezuela is going to stop using international law for the defense of our sovereignty, of the president and of the first lady. We're going to continue using it. Why? Because I have said international law is dead, but with our actions in the defense of the president, in defense of the first lady, and in defense of our sovereignty and all the organisms that correspond, we have the vanguard. We can do the will, and the people have to accompany us, and also the world, for that international law to be rebirthed, not in a writing, not in the article such, but in a letter that is alive. So I put as an example the Constitution of the 61, when there was the meeting of the lawyers that united over 2,000 members, and I said the Constitution of the 61 was approved from the Congress, approved it after a law firm did it in an office for a week that was dark of Caracas. But on the same day that it was approved, that Constitution, Romulo Betancourt suspended all of the guarantees and started the shit first and find out later. And what was the Constitution of 61 turned into a dead letter for over 4 decades. Now, the constituent process came, and also the birth of the Constitution of 99. That is why I say that we have to do all of this that I mentioned to become a life letter. For what? For the defense of the presidential and a chief of state, because what have I said here on? Any chief of state of the whole world, of Italy, of Spain, of Germany, of Japan, of any country of the Middle East, or of Latin America, can happen the same thing using any lie or alibi like the one it was used by Trump. For example, the subject of the cartel of the Suns that they don't mention anymore. The department said that that cartel of the Suns doesn't exist, and I have gone beyond that. When it could have been existed was between the 1990 and 1993, and it was a creation of the CIA and the DEA under the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez in his second mandate. And you will say, where are the proof of that? Look at the declarations that have been given by Gurugov, the owner of the mercenary company Silver Cup. He said that he's aware that that was a creation of the CIA and the DEA, that even the cartel of the Suns was created in the US to traffic drugs from Venezuela towards the US and the whole world. It has been said by someone who used to be of the CIA, but also that is registered. The government of Hugo Chavez was after the government of Caldera, and when his government was happening, the decommissions of drugs have been impeccable and relentless, an example in the entire world, such as the case that the organisms that study this subject in the UN reveal that Venezuela is one of the countries that has had the biggest comebacks against the drug trafficking groups, despite the 95% of the drugs that reaches the US and Europe does not come from Venezuela, but from the coast of the Pacific, which are the countries Brazil, Ecuador, Paraguay, Argentina, but Colombia. What does that have to do with Venezuela? Absolutely nothing. And less than 5% would leave from the Colombian Guajira occupied territory, but that was the alibi saying, can you believe that, without showing the evidence that Venezuela trafficked set amount of drugs to the US? Where are the evidence? The evidence means audios, videos, phone extracts that for decades say it, testimonies, confessions, detentions on people that did that, and also the dismantling of cartels in Venezuela that could say to you something like that, and it doesn't exist by not existing. What is it? It is an alibi, an operation of a false flag to justify this last thing that has happened that truly has no precedence in the history of humanity. That is not even similar to what happened in Iraq or Libya or Panama. I would say that it is a mix of the three scenarios, the Iraq and Libya, because of the subject of taking petroleum and the use of force. Fortunately, Venezuela is a country of peace, and maybe that was what the imperial enemy wanted, and the extreme right, to create the burning of the entire country, of all its infrastructure, violence, but the people have had the dignity, the serenity, and the stoicism of maintaining, standing and not reaching those levels that allowed the US, not only the military occupation, up to this point there's still troops leaving Iraq. After 1991, it was the first phase of the invasion of the US to Iraq. The second one was in 2003, which generated all that we know. See how many years have passed. 35 years after that, is that allegedly the last troops of the US are leaving Iraq. In Libya, it happened the same thing. In Panama, they used the bombing and they killed 2,000 people, and they kidnapped someone who was not an acting president. He had not been elected. In this case, Noriega, that up to a while ago was an agent of the CIA of the US. So in the Venezuelan case, it is all at the same time. If one starts looking with real eyes, what does it generate? Well, if it's been an unprecedented act as an offense to the world and to international law, to peace and to democracy, what does the planet have to do? Call not only to a dialogue, but impose. Look, I know that when one speaks like this, many people don't believe it, but there's no other mechanism than supporting the acting president, Dr. Delcy Rodriguez, and all of the plans that she has for that diplomacy of peace with the whole world. Our foreign ministry is active, speaking with all of the governments of the world. There has been condemnations, but that is not enough. If I am allowed, I believe that when one speaks, for example, how many times was in the Statute of Rome and the International Court mentioned, but does this action implicated a crime of aggression? The Article 8 was violated of the Statute of Rome, that is named by so many people linked to human rights. A great exception in the world needs to be had by the human rights activists, many NGOs, national and international, acting literally. They did a communique, and in the middle of it, it says 2 lines saying that they do not agree with the kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro, but the rest is justifying the narrative because they were the ones who opened the doors to the circumstances, saying that Venezuela didn't have a democracy, that Venezuela was a country or a failed state, when it was all the contrary. See the levels. They did not speak of the blockade 1,100 unilateral coercive measures that stops one from buying or selling their products, and looking for the asphyxiation and having also as a consequence that the migration. When they say for the families to return, but you were the spokesman of the extreme right, those who fomented the measures of blockade, the coercive sanctions, the unilateral, that implicated to look for the collapse of our economy. And with all of that, Venezuela was able to overcome that obstacle and set itself in a new destiny, but they didn't care. Likewise, as I pointed out, when one looks from 100 to 120 Venezuelan citizens that were innocent. There were old ladies and children sleeping at that hour that were murdered. And also the members of the National Bolivarian Armed Forces and the security body in the basis of an agreement between Cuba and Venezuela. There was also Cuban officers who heroically, let's say, were murdered in combat. That was not, as they had tried to say in a narrative, a surrender. How could there be a surrender of 120 civilians and military murdered with people that were murdered on the floor? We have 5 attorneys that are investigating these facts because the world needs to know it and they have to awaken. And I have a conclusion of this first part of your program. What does this conclude? There's a demand that is unique: the unconditional freedom of President Nicolás Maduro and the Deputy and First Lady Cilia Flores. Let's not forget that Dr. Cilia Flores is an elected deputy and she also has immunity, and all of that was violated and it was turned into pieces. Like, those who support that believe that they can be, that nothing is ever going to happen to them. They feel that they're shielded, that they are far away from an action. Look, all actions have reactions. Negative karma exists, and you reap what you sow. So, as one denounces the U.S. aggression in the terms I have said, I denounce all of those factors of the extreme right that opened the doors for this situation where they died. See, they never speak of these civilians and military who were murdered as if they never existed, as if they were less than an object. We reivindicate them. We think and we believe and we are convinced that in basis of all of this, international law needs to be rebirthed in a way in which, in this particular case, the judge of the cause decrees in the hearing that will be in March the immediate freedom of the President Nicolás Maduro.
Are you completely sure of that?
Well, my fight is framed in this because we are the titles of the criminal and the justice action of Venezuela, and we have the quality also inside the citizen power of assuming the defense of the state and its institutions. And in this case, Nicolás Maduro was the chief of state who was elected on July the 28th of 2024, and they could never refute said election. They posted in a page that was taken down 48 hours ago and acts that were repeated. A person appeared 4 times voting there and voting for someone who was not their candidate. That was denounced at the moment. That is why it was taken down 2 days after. How is that possible? They could have given to the CNE the alleged real acts. They did not give anything because they didn't have anything, but that was the excuse to start all of this narrative from July of 2024 and to end with this action that has put the world on the outside. That is why I believe that we have to raise our voices. The world in the US, there are people that are against all of this that happened. See, the Congress of the US is totally divided. Even the own Republicans have manifested against it, the Democrats, because so we are going back to where if tomorrow any country who has wealth or an hegemon empire says, I want to take over the petroleum, the lithium that country has, of the so-called rare earths. Now the focal point is on Greenland, but let's see why Greenland. For what is the war of the machine guns, not the diplomacy, but the wars of, and also what is the multipolarity focus in various sequences and places and scenarios of war. Greenland is a key point to attack the Soviet Union and Russia, the Russian Federation, for those who didn't know. So forget that it is not. Say they have gold, they have minerals that is of Greenland, so you cannot take that to dominate what territorially that place and then attack China and attack Russia. So the world is going to end where the voices that are in pacifism and the world's youth need to rise, because it is very infamous that to excuse themselves of an action such as this one, they have said so many lies that the train of Aragua was very dismantled in Venezuela by the judicial authorities and the public ministry. Over 100 detained. The place where they had their headquarters was dismantled, orders of apprehension, but then they say that the train of Aragua are millions. But how million? That is something incredible, even an offense to those who believed in the American dream. No, we're going to go to work in the US, and look how they qualify them. So it is something that it is incredibly false that we have how to show it is false. If you receive as a judge acts that say all of these false things, the defense allegates the contrary, you have to quickly, without any doubt, proceed to the immediate release of the president and of Dr.
That is what Venezuela is waiting for, and many other places in the world also. With this aggression and the kidnapping of this presidential couple, in the return we will be talking about the impact of social networks and the media in this new stage, this new moment, not only for Venezuela but Bolivarian revolution. Let's go to a pause at this moment.
We have a short break now, but don't go away. We'll be right back with more on this exclusive interview with Venezuela's Attorney General, Tarek William Saab. Welcome back to the exclusive interview with Venezuela's Attorney General, Tarek William Saab.
Thank you for following us in this show. This special interview with the Attorney General of Venezuela, Tarek William Saab, is joining us with these thoughts regarding what happened in Venezuela in the last few weeks, and in some way also, Attorney General, in social networks, in this misinformation campaigns in a country such as Venezuela. I ask you this because we see, on the one hand, information from the United States that was showing the U.S. flag in Venezuelan territory, but also condecorations to the CIA, a lot of misinformation, false information that is putting on debate in Venezuela and in the international context what is happening here. So asking you about this, considering that the Venezuelan government is already talking about a new stage in terms of institutionality and the relationship with the United States. How are you looking at this stage?
Well, look, in the first place, I do not know if you would say, you, for example, who are a studious that are amazed. I am amazed of this. I am not amazed. In the first place, because I would say the face of the hybrid war, the real face, is to lie. Goebbels was literally, as a preschooler, Goebbels, that subject who said, repeating a lie 1,000 times to turn it into a truth, next to what has happened in planet Earth, in the stage of humanity, that it is very dark in the name of the connotations, said that a face of the most relentless, of the worst, and I would say of the dirtiest of the hybrid war, is the cognitive war. Never forget, and I have always denounced this for 20 years. When it was spoken of a fourth generation war, I remembered in different writings and speeches I said, the lethal of the hybrid war, in such hybrid war, it is in itself a group of all of the wars, an armed conventional war, a non-conventional war. And we go back to the word war, a judicial war, using itself the institutions of the state for it, what was tried by the enemy in the year 2017, when the so-called guarimbas in the middle of civilian wars, taking advantage of a sentence that was dictated by the TCJ, that immediately were rectified. When I say immediately, I mean in hours. The mistake was fixed, and the general attorney of the time, a traitor and a coward that is fleeing justice in several countries, said, using that fact that there had been a coup and other things, to do what? To give a green light to what that civilian war was meant, that embryo of that civil war. There was almost 150 deaths. There was 2,000 injured in the defense of the people. We did a report of what that moment meant, with the proposals, with the respective denunciations. 50% of the people that were murdered there were police and officers of the armed forces, the majority linked to the FAM of the National Guard, the others innocent civilians that were shot and burned. By who? The great majority of these civilians that were murdered by people that were high and covering their faces, those who received $5 or $10, minuscule number. There was images that show that they were given that to shoot and burn. They burned institutions of the state. They burned alive Orlando Figuera. Or is it that the world forgot that in the midst of that it was tried the law for the judicial coup, with the green light that the violence had, to say that it was the state, it was the violent groups, those who did all of this in the majority. There was an inaction of the public ministry. It did not act, and that lasted 4 months, deaths and injured. So then the general attorney of the time, looking by the TCJ and the citizens' power to open a trial to the magistrates too. And as the National Assembly was in the hands of the opposition of the extreme right, from there they launched that. And that was tried in Venezuela, and it was attempted in Venezuela, a coup inside of the hybrid war twice, in April 11th of 2002, of which I was a victim. I had a better luck than the dozens of innocent citizens that were shot by snipers of Central America. that were put in the Eden Hotel in Ansonia, and they shot and killed the dozen of Venezuelans to justify the pronunciation of the coup members and the traitors that were detained at the moment, because it was still the government of Hugo Chavez in functions on April 11th. But then what comes on the 12th, they were released to those snipers that were murderers. For you to have an idea, then the petroleum coup came, the economical war, which is part of the hybrid war. Then came the attempt of murdering the president using drones on August 4th of 2018 to kill the president and the high commander in Avenue Bolivar. That was an operation totally approved by the government of the US of the time, and it had its hand all of those of the extreme rights that were part of that action. And then it was detained the people for a crime as bad as that when they were called political prisoners. Then came the coup of April 30th of 2019, the attempt of coup. They used police member guards and they failed. See, all of that was being carried to this hate for not accomplishing the objective. Then was the attempt of invasion, the military incursion of the Operation Haitian in May of the year 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, in the middle of the quarantine, something that had never been seen, the economical blockade with the unilateral coercive measures playing their worst role that happened. So all of that is part of the hybrid war with the component that you mentioned, the component of cognitive war, to wash brains and to delete all of this that I have mentioned, the enemy action using weapons, using the economical war, using the sanctions, using bombings, and using coups, and using embryos of civil war, burning people alive and buildings. All of that is deleted according to the phases of cognitive war, and they turn you then the bad and good. No, they're not terrorists, they're not criminals, those who killed Orlando Figueroa, those who burned everything that could be in the midst, those who were told to shut police and guards. And then they used quotes and called them liberators. Those who ask for an invasion, those who ask for an invasion, those who look to fill Venezuela with blood, no, they deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, and they're peaceful people. That is a vomit that has made the planet disgusted, and we see the letters of many people that have called it to peace. For example, the Nobel Prize of Argentina, you have seen what he said. He did a letter that was very exact, denouncing the fallacy symbols of rock, like Roger Waters, and even the committee of the Nobel Peace Prize. That prize doesn't exist anymore, for you to know. That prize, as it was pulverized international law, the Nobel Peace Prize was also imploded, and it doesn't exist. That who receives it, that who puts themselves to get that prize, it is an initiative of something, of a bad thing, because it is supposed that the Nobel Prize is for those who seek for peace, for those who do not favor violent action, those who do not call for invasion, those who do not ask for economical sanctions that create deaths and injured and migrants to other countries. So obviously we have to use communication media that are alternative, like this one, teleSUR, and everything that is at our reach, to say the truths that we are saying, for people to take conscience and see. They speak that supposedly the migrants are the ones that went to the US for the American dream, and now it's a sport to kill migrants, or US citizens of origins that fight in favor of migrants, to give them 4 shots in an extrajudicial execution, and there's no responsible person. So where are human rights? So see, I have seen Venezuelan NGOs that are shameful. Turn yourselves into parties of the extreme right. The communiques that you do are to be sent to the Guaya River. Do you know why? Because they justify all of the narrative of what happened, saying those lies to which you made reference, that Venezuela didn't have democracy, that this was a failed state, a dictatorship, this and there. When we know all of this that I have said, and it has happened, what I have denounced here, these 25, 26 years of defending ourselves from that hybrid war that has used all of the world's mechanisms. To tell me the presidents that have acted encouraging all of this and calling, no, Venezuela is not a democracy, it is a dictatorship, this or that. They are the responsible, they are intellectual authors of all of this. Why? Because they put a red carpet to the invasion, to occupation of the airspace, to the serial murder. So obviously the truth need to be said. The Department of Justice even says that the cartel of the Suns doesn't exist, as the train of Aragua doesn't exist, and I could add the great majority of Venezuelans that have migrated to the US and other countries of the world are healthy people and good people. They're hard-working people, victims of that hybrid war that encouraged through the unilateral sanctions immigration. So it's for me to say that all Colombians that have come to Venezuela during the 70s up to now are criminals. Of course not, independently that a Colombian has committed a crime, or a Central American or a Peruvian or someone from the Middle East or a nation or an European, whether it's Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, any of the nationalities that I am mentioning. If they committed a crime, it is processed, but one cannot from there say all of the migrants that have come to Venezuela are delinquent, because there is a micro-minority group that committed a crime. That is what they have looked to turn into Satans, and that is part of the dirty hybrid war and cognitive war against the Venezuelan migrant. That is a lie, because it has been proven. Say the big murderers, the big members of cartels and brutal criminally actions in the US, the 0.0001 and beyond percent, they might be of a Venezuelan nationality, but now you say no, because in an X place in a suburb a Venezuela committed a crime, but a country of millions of dozens of millions of inhabitants that a national commit a crime makes you shoot the Venezuelan nationality in its entirety. I do not agree. It is not truth, and we have to go out in defense, obviously, of what is our truth based in the world.
You were talking, Attorney General, of peace, and you were mentioning this topic because this is also being talked about in social networks, and the decision to release the detainees.
Well, in the first place, I have to highlight that it has been a policy of the Venezuelan state, even of the time of Hugo Chavez, to dictate not only in times of December, not only in set dates as it could be given due to a historical situation, but in a permanent way, measures that are inside the Venezuelan process typified as this one, measures that are less grave, of privation of freedom, and that has been a constant. If you say after July 28th, to speak of a critical moment from July 28th of 2024 up until December 31st of 2025, being in functions the President of the Republic, Nicolas Maduro Moros, was dictated, I calculate, over 2,000 revisions of measures. Listen carefully, the number, over 2,000, that it was the time to do to any of the reasons that are established in the Venezuelan law, in the Constitution. These people were subject to those, and I go beyond being Dr. Delcy Rodriguez as the acting president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. She, assuming the full exercise of her functions, have also done it in a consecutive way from January 3rd, and it has been a policy of Dr. Delcy Rodriguez as acting president, as defender of human rights, because, and I would like to give you an anecdote if I'm allowed. In the year 92 approximately, I was already an activist of human rights linked to the Commission of Justice and Peace of Petare, and the father Matias Camuña was a lawyer exercise participating in the defense president, the later president commander Hugo Chavez, and also other commanders like Douglas Bravo and Francisco Salazar, etc. And this anecdote is interesting because the Dr. Delcy Rodriguez in that time was very young, and she was the lawyer, the judicial consultor of the Human Rights Commission of the Congress. So she ended her work there, and she went to study outside of the country, and she gave me, let's say it like that, the position. I assumed that judicial consultation of that Commission of Human Rights. From that time, Dr. Delcy Rodriguez and myself, we have had that empathy in the defense, in the fight for human rights, in her case, and of Jorge, CA, father, teacher Jorge Rodriguez, who was brutally murdered in a selective way due to tortures that lasted 4 days. So obviously, we come from there, from that school, and we have done what they didn't do with us, what they have never done with us, fascism with us. The times that it has had to act is for the extermination. It is to ravage the land. Hugo Chavez wins in December of the year 98. Year 99 came, and he called the country to a national dialogue and called for a constituent. Then elections came one after the other, and see how that extreme right paid him with a coup on April 11th with an attempt to murder him. So see, we are different, but the people need to understand. The people has not listened to that extreme right. They thought that with the kidnapping of the citizen president Nicolás Maduro and Dr. Silvia Flores, First Lady, there would be a type of Caracazo, 1 million people on the streets manifesting joy, national joy. And it didn't happen because this people is not like this. Understand that these people do not have on their blood the fascism, the Nazism, the neo-Nazism, the Zionism as a doctrine. On the contrary, they have Bolivarianism, they have humanism, they have been educated in other values as more people when they come here. You that spoke with the cognitive war, I agree with you, the damage that it has caused, because there's a lot of people that ends believing in those fake news that are worse than the one before. And our work is not only to defend ourselves, but also to go to the offensive with the truth and saying our truth to the world without no fear. And that is why we are here today. They did not accomplish what they wanted. They wanted that worse, that million of people that were allegedly going to celebrate the kidnapping of the citizen president Nicolás Maduro and of his wife Silvia Flores falls. On the contrary, what happened were works of pain, sadness, and melancholy. We are turning those feelings in an epic for a battle for the freedom of our brothers that deserve a return to home immediately, as we have accomplished to rescue the prisoners that were in chains. We have to listen to the testimonies. This program that is seen in many countries of the world, what happened with the almost 300 Venezuelans that were handcuffed and in chains in the in El Salvador, that did not for the international court to judge Bukele for violating the Statute of Rome, for violating international law, for violating the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, for committing in a serial manner tortures, inhuman and degrading ways of treatment, taking away freedom, among other crimes that happened there. And see, nothing was done. How is that that the narrative of the media war, that action of Bukele needs to be applauded? And what Venezuela has done by defending itself from people that using weapons, conventional and unconventional, have looked to assault cartels, to murder and to kill. Do they have to have impunity? Do they not need to be processed? They need to be processed in the middle of a judicial process. Some can be liberated, yes. Others can be also as well, and that is part of the process, and that has always been done. There's many witnesses, but they don't say it. They don't dare to give their face and make reference that those acts have been done in the basis of what is the right to a fair trial. But in the case of President Nicolas Maduro, then that taking off the freedom that is illegitimate has a right to be violating all of the international treaties. How could they justify that?
The political parties in Venezuela, have they understood this?
Well, I believe that now there is a stage where anyone, even the factors of opposition that are here, they know that tomorrow they can have the same thing happen to them. Wasn't Noriega a closed member of the CIA and the US, and they took him? It has happened with other chiefs of state who have served to the empire in other countries of the world, or political factors that are associated with them. At the end, they were murdered, they were persecuted, they were disappeared. So it is a subject that needs to be looked at. That is why I go back to the calling that acting president Dr. Delcy Rodriguez does, the diplomacy, the Bolivarian diplomacy of peace. She was foreign minister. She knows of all of this that I am mentioning. She knows the reach of each one of these steps that need to be made, and she's doing it in an exceptional way, because what we have accomplished is a deed. After this happened, it was supposed what they might have dreamt, the extreme right that gave so much for something like this to happen. Millions of Venezuelans on the streets protesting, celebrating this, calling to a ravaged land. The governability imposed, the principle of cooperation between public powers was imposed, and we were with the citizen acting president Dr. Delcy Rodriguez on the same day, on January 3rd, and I gave some words to our people, giving them strength at 7 in the morning of January 3rd. That day, I was almost 2 days without sleeping, and one of the actions that we did together with the acting president was assisting, going to the Council of Security and Defense of the Nation in hours of midday of that January 3rd. Then it was the oath taking and the installation of the National Assembly. Then after that, the oath taking of the acting president Dr. Delcy Rodriguez, then the communication to all of the public powers of the installation of the assembly, all of that in a sequence. And you might ask me about what day: January 3rd, January 4th, January 5th, January 6th, and now we are at what day?
January 20th.
Monday, and we are live, and all of this has happened in an unstoppable way, proving to the world that those who have the quality, the real and the mind and the will and the balance to govern are the forces that are today, as it is seen, as civilian and military authorities
In union.
Political and institutional.
The police, military, and popular union.
I would add military and institutional, 5 to a hand, to 5 fingers. This functioning in a cohesive way, and the world needs to react. Look, first, to stop looking and of consuming that vomit that comes from a great majority of social media done exclusively for this, for the cognitive war. That is the first thing, to look for the real sources, to see go out on the streets and see what is happening, and obviously to defend. We're defending ourselves before international organisms, accompanying President in the process, totally at the margin of the law, because the U.S. is not the judicial territory to process a chief of state of Venezuela, to a political leader of Venezuela, etc. It is not. It is that simple. Just with that, everything is illegal. And it must be declared that cannot proceed, and to declare the absolute freedom of the President of the Republic and of the First Lady and Deputy Cilia Flores.
We will continue that situation, of course, with great detail and great attention of what is happening in the United States and the defense of sovereignty in a country like Venezuela. Thank you so much for your time with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And like this, we are ending this special interview with the Attorney General of Venezuela, Tarek William Saab.
We're witnessing an exclusive interview with Venezuela's Attorney General Tarek William Saab, hosted by our journalist Luis Blandon, a conversation in which the high Venezuelan official highlighted the firmness and absolute dignity of the Venezuelan people, the dignity of the Bolivarian armed forces, and the bravery of acting President Delcy Rodriguez following the U.S. attack of January 3rd, a military aggression that Saab characterized as a flagrant violation of international law with no precedent in the recent history of humanity. Attorney General finished his statements demanding the unconditional and immediate liberation of President Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores. This is all for the moment. Stay tuned with teleSUR English for more information on Venezuela and the world.